From CJSW Studio 1 in Calgary. CJSW Playhouse. Tonight on the CJSW Playhouse, we bring you James Thurber's The Catbird Seat, starring Robert Carrick, Angie Stimson, Mike Anthony, and narrated by Stuart Bentley. Sit back and enjoy tonight's play as the curtain rises. Mr. Martin bought the pack of Camels on Monday night in the most crowded cigar store on Broadway. It was theater time, and 7 or 8 men were buying cigarettes. The clerk didn't even glance at Mr. Martin, who put the pack in his overcoat pocket and went out. If any of the staff at F&S had seen him buy the cigarettes, they would have been astonished, for it was generally known that Mr. Martin did not smoke and never had. No one saw him. It was just a week to the day since Mr. Martin had decided to rub out Mrs. Uljean Barrows. The term rub out pleased him because it suggested nothing more than the correction of an error. In this case, an error of Mr. Fitweiler. Mr. Martin had spent each night of the past week working out his plan and examining it. As he walked home now, he went over it again. For the 100th time, he resented the element of imprecision, the margin of guesswork that entered into the business. The project, as he had worked it out, was casual and bold. The risks were considerable. Something might go wrong anywhere along the line, and therein lay the cunning of his scheme. No one would ever see in it the cautious, painstaking hand of Irwin Martin, head of the filing department at F&S, of whom Mr. Fitweiler had once said,
"Man is fallible, but Martin isn't."
No one would see his hand, that is, unless it were caught in the act. Sitting in his apartment, drinking a glass of milk, Mr. Martin reviewed his case against Mrs. Uljean Barrows, as he had every night for 7 nights. He began at the beginning. Her quacking voice and braying laugh had first profaned the halls of F&S on March 7, 1941. Mr. Martin had a head for dates. Old Roberts, the personnel chief, had introduced her as the newly appointed special advisor to the president of the firm, Mr. Fitweiler. The woman had appalled Mr. Martin instantly, but he hadn't shown it. He had given her his dry hand, a look of studious concentration, and a faint smile.
"Well,"
she had said, looking at the papers on his desk,
"are you lifting the ox cart out of the ditch?"
As Mr. Martin recalled that moment over his milk, he squirmed slightly. He must keep his mind on her crimes as a special advisor, not on her peccadillos as a personality. This he found difficult to do, in spite of entering an objection and sustaining it. The faults of the woman as a woman kept chattering on in his mind like an unruly witness. She had, for almost 2 years now, baited him. In the halls, in the elevator, even in his own office, into which she romped now and then like a circus horse. She was constantly shouting these silly questions at him, Are you lifting the ox cart out of the ditch? Are you tearing up the pea patch? Are you hollering down the rain barrel? Are you scraping around the bottom of the pickle barrel? Are you sitting in the catbird seat? It was Joey Hart, one of Mr. Martin's 2 assistants, who had explained what the gibberish meant.
She must be a Dodger fan. Red Barber announces the Dodger games over the radio. He uses those expressions. Picked them up down south.
Joey had gone on to explain 1 or 2. Tearing up the pea patch meant going on a rampage. Sitting in the catbird seat means sitting pretty, like a batter with 3 balls and no strikes on him. Mr. Martin dismissed all this with an effort. It had been annoying. It had driven him near to distraction, but he was too solid a man to be moved to murder by anything so childish. It was fortunate, he reflected, as he passed on to the important charges against Mrs. Barrows, that he had stood up under it so well. He had maintained always an outward appearance of polite tolerance.
"Why, I even believe you like the woman,"
Miss Peard, his other assistants, had once said to him. He had simply smiled. A gavel rapped in Mr. Martin's mind, and the case proper was resumed. Mrs. Eugene Barrows stood charged with willful, blatant, and persistent attempts to destroy the efficiency and system of F&S. It was competent, material, and relevant to review her advent and rise to power. Mr. Martin had got the story from Miss Peard, who seemed always able to find things out. According to her, Mrs. Barrows had met Mr. Fitweiler at a party where she had rescued him from the embraces of a powerfully built drunken man who had mistaken the president of F&S for a famous retired Middle Western football coach. She had led him to a sofa and somehow worked upon him a monstrous magic. The aging gentleman had jumped to the conclusion there and then that this was a woman of singular attainments, equipped to bring out the best in him and in the firm. A week later, he had introduced her into F&S as his special adviser. On that day, confusion got its foot in the door. After Miss Tyson, Mr. Brundage, and Mr. Bartlett had been fired, and Mr. Munson had taken his hat and stalked out, mailing in his resignation later, old Roberts had been emboldened to speak to Mr. Fitweiler. He mentioned that Mr. Munson's department had been a little disrupted, and hadn't they perhaps better resume the old system there? Mr. Fitweiler had said certainly not. He had the greatest faith in Mrs. Barrows' ideas.
They require a little seasoning. A little seasoning is all.
Mr. Roberts had given it up. Mr. Martin reviewed in detail all the changes wrought by Mrs. Barrows. She had begun chipping at the cornices of the firm's edifice, and now she was swinging at the foundation stones with a pickaxe. Mr. Martin came now, in his summing up, to the afternoon of Monday, November 2, 1942, just 1 week ago. On that day, at 3 p.m., Mrs. Barrows had bounced into his office.
Boo! Are you scraping around the bottom of the pickle barrel?
Mr. Martin had looked at her from under his green eye shade, saying nothing. She had begun to wander about the office, taking it in with her great popping eyes.
Do you really need all these filing cabinets?
Mr. Martin's heart had jumped.
Each of these files plays an indispensable part in the system of F&S.
She had braided him.
Well, don't tear up the pea patch.
And gone to the door. From there she had bawled,
But you sure have got a lot of fine scrap in here.
Mr. Martin could no longer doubt that the finger was on his beloved department. Her pickaxe was on the upswing, poised for the first blow. It had not come yet. He had received no blue memo from the enchanted Mr. Fitweiler bearing nonsensical instructions deriving from the obscene woman. But there was no doubt in Mr. Martin's mind that one would be forthcoming. He must act quickly. Already a precious week had gone by. Mr. Martin stood up in his living room, still holding his milk glass.
Gentlemen of the jury, I demand the death penalty for this horrible person.
The next day, Mr. Martin followed his routine as usual. He polished his glasses more often, and once sharpened an already sharp pencil, but not even Miss Peard noticed. Only once did he catch sight of his victim. She swept past him in the hall with a patronizing
Hi.
At 5:30 he walked home as usual and had a glass of milk as usual. He had never drunk anything stronger in his life, unless you could count ginger ale. The late Sam Schlosser, the S of F&S, had praised Mr. Martin at a staff meeting several years before for his temperate habits.
Our most efficient worker neither drinks nor smokes. The results speak for themselves.
Mr. Fitweiler had sat by, nodding approval. Mr. Martin was still thinking about that red-letter day as he walked over to the Schrafts on 5th Avenue near 46th Street. He got there, as he always did, at 8 o'clock. He finished his dinner and the financial page of the Sun at 8:45, as he always did. It was his custom after dinner to take a walk. This time, he walked down 5th Avenue at a casual pace. His gloved hands felt moist and warm, his forehead cold. He transferred the camels from his overcoat to a jacket pocket. He wondered as he did so if they did not represent an unnecessary note of strain. Mrs. Barrows smoked only Luckies. It was his idea to puff a few puffs on a Camel after the rubbing out, stub it out in the ashtray holding her lipstick-stained Luckies, and thus drag a small red herring across the trail. Perhaps it was not a good idea. It would take time. He might even choke too loudly. Mr. Martin had never seen the house on West 12th Street where Mrs. Barrows lived, but he had a clear enough picture of it. Fortunately, she had bragged to everybody about her ducky first-floor apartment in the perfectly darling 3-story red brick. There would be no doorman or other attendants, just the tenants of the 2nd and 3rd floors. As he walked along, Mr. Martin realized that he would get there before 9:30. He had considered walking north on 5th Avenue from Schrafts to a point from which it would take him until 10 o'clock to reach the house. At that hour, people were less likely to be coming in or going out. But the procedure would have made an awkward loop in the straight thread of his casualness, and he had abandoned it. It was impossible to figure when people would be entering or leaving the house anyway. There was a great risk at any hour. If he ran into anybody, he would simply have to place the rubbing out of Ulgene Barrows in the inactive file forever. The same thing would hold true if there were someone in her apartment. In that case, he would just say that he had been passing by, recognized her charming house, and thought to drop in. It was 18 minutes after 9 when Mr. Martin turned into 12th Street. A man passed him, and a man and a woman talking. There was no one within 50 paces when he came to the house, halfway down the block. He was up the steps and in the small vestibule in no time, pressing the bell under the card that said Mrs. Ulgene Barrows. When the clicking in the lock started, he jumped forward against the door. He got inside fast, closing the door behind him. A bulb in a lantern hung from the hall ceiling on a chain seemed to give a monstrously bright light. There was nobody on the stair which went up ahead of him along the left wall. A door opened down the hall in the wall on the right. He went toward it swiftly on tiptoe.
Well, for God's sake, look who's here!
He rushed past her like a football tackle bumping her.
Hey, quit shoving!
She said, closing the door behind them. They were in her living room, which seemed to Mr. Martin to be lighted by 100 lamps.
What's after you? You're as jumpy as a goat.
He found he was unable to speak. His heart was wheezing in his throat.
Yes.
He finally brought out. She was jabbering and laughing as she started to help him off with his coat.
No. I'll put it here.
He took it off and put it on a chair near the door.
Your hat and gloves, too. You're in a lady's house.
He put his hat on top of the coat. Mrs. Barrows seemed larger than he had thought. He kept his gloves on.
I was passing by. I recognized... Is there anyone here?
No, we're all alone. Oh, you're as white as a sheet, you funny man. Whatever has come over you? I'll mix you a toddy.
She started toward a door across the room.
Scotch and soda be all right? Oh, but say, you don't drink, do you?
She turned and gave him her amused look. Mr. Martin pulled himself together.
Scotch and soda will be all right.
He could hear her laughing in the kitchen. Mr. Martin looked quickly around the living room for the weapon. He had counted on finding one there. There were andirons and a poker, and something in a corner that looked like an Indian club. None of them would do. It couldn't be that way. He began to pace around. He came to a desk. On it lay a metal paper knife with an ornate handle. Would it be sharp enough? He reached for it and knocked over a small brass jar. Stamps spilled out of it and it fell to the floor with a clatter.
Hey, are you tearing up the pea patch?
Mr. Martin gave a strange laugh. Picking up the knife, he tried its point against his left wrist. It was blunt. It wouldn't do. When Mrs. Barrows reappeared, carrying 2 highballs, Mr. Martin, standing there with his gloves on, became acutely conscious of the fantasy he had wrought. Cigarettes in his pocket, a drink prepared for him, it was all too grossly improbable. It was more than that, it was impossible. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a vague idea stirred, sprouted.
For heaven's sake, take off those gloves.
I always wear them in the house.
The idea began to bloom, strange and wonderful. She put the glasses on a coffee table in front of the sofa and sat on the sofa.
Come over here, you odd little man.
Mr. Martin went over and sat beside her. It was difficult getting a cigarette out of the pack of Camels, but he managed it. She held a match for him, laughing.
Well, this is perfectly marvelous. You with a drink and a cigarette.
Mr. Martin puffed, not too awkwardly, and took a gulp of the highball.
I drink and smoke all the time.
He clinked his glass against hers.
Here's nuts to that old windbag, Fitweiler.
The stuff tasted awful, but he made no grimace.
Really, Mr. Martin, you are insulting our employer.
Mrs. Barrows was now all special advisor to the president.
I am preparing a bomb, which will blow that old goat higher than hell.
He had only had a little of the drink, which was not strong. It couldn't be that.
Do you take dope or something?
Heroin. I'll be coked to the gills when I bump that old buzzard off.
Mr. Martin, that will be all of that. You must go at once.
Mr. Martin took another swallow of his drink. He tapped his cigarette out in the ashtray and put the pack of Camels on the coffee table. Then he got up. She stood glaring at him. He walked over and put on his hat and coat.
Not a word about this.
He said, and laid an index finger against his lips. All Mrs. Barrows could bring out was,
Really?
Mr. Martin put his hand on the doorknob.
I'm sitting in the catbird seat.
He stuck his tongue out at her and left. Nobody saw him go. Mr. Martin got to his apartment walking well before 11. No one saw him go in. He had 2 glasses of milk after brushing his teeth, and he felt elated. It wasn't tipsiness, because he hadn't been tipsy. Anyway, the walk had worn off all effects of the whiskey. He got in bed and read a magazine for a while. He was asleep before midnight. Mr. Martin got to the office at 8:30 the next morning, as usual. At 8:45, Eugene Barrows, who had never before arrived at work before 10, swept into his office.
I'm reporting you to Mr. Fitweiler now. If he turns you over to the police, it's no more than you deserve.
Mr. Martin gave her a look of shocked surprise.
I beg your pardon?
Mrs. Barrows snorted and bounced out of the room, leaving Miss Peard and Joey Hart staring after her.
What's the matter with that old devil now?
I have no idea.
The other 2 looked at him and then at each other. Miss Peard got up and went out. She walked slowly past the closed door of Mr. Fitweiler's office. Mrs. Barrows was yelling inside, but she was not braying. Miss Peard could not hear what the woman was saying. She went back to her desk. 45 minutes later, Mrs. Barrows left the president's office and went into her own, shutting the door. It wasn't until half an hour later that Mr. Fitweiler sent for Mr. Martin. The head of the filing department, neat, quiet, attentive, stood in front of the old man's desk. Mr. Fitweiler was pale and nervous. He took his glasses off and twiddled them. He made a small bruffing sound in his throat.
Martin, you have been with us for more than 20 years.
22, sir.
In that time, your work and your, manner have been exemplary.
I trust so, sir.
I have understood, Martin, that you have never taken a drink or smoked.
That is correct, sir.
Ah, yes. You may describe what you did after leaving the office yesterday, Martin.
Mr. Martin allowed less than a second for his bewildered pause.
Certainly, sir. I walked home. Then I went to Schraff's for dinner. Afterward, I walked home again. I went to bed early and I read a magazine for a while. I was asleep before 11.
Ah, yes.
He was silent for a moment, searching for the proper words to say to the head of the filing department.
Mrs. Barrows. Mrs. Barrows has worked hard, Martin. Very hard. It grieves me to report that she has suffered a severe breakdown. It has taken the form of a persecution complex accompanied by distressing hallucinations.
I'm very sorry, sir.
Mrs. Barrows is under the delusion that you visited her last evening and behaved yourself in a unseemly manner.
He raised his hand to silence Mr. Martin's little pained outcry.
It is the nature of these psychological diseases to fix upon the least likely and most innocent party as the, source of persecution. These matters are not for the lay mind to grasp. Martin, I've just had my psychiatrist, Dr. Fitch, on the phone. He would not, of course, commit himself, but he made enough generalizations to substantiate my suspicions. I suggested to Mrs. Barrows, when she completed her, story to me this morning, that she visit Dr. Fitch, for I suspected a condition at once. She flew, I regret to say, into a rage and requested that I call you on the carpet. You may not know, Martin, but Mrs. Barrows had planned a reorganization of your department. Subject to my approval, of course. Subject to my approval. This brought you, rather than anyone else, to her mind. But again, that is a phenomenon for Dr. Fitch and not for us. So, Martin, I am afraid Mrs. Barrows' usefulness here is at an end.
Dreadfully sorry, sir.
It was at this point that the door to the office blew open with the suddenness of a gas main explosion, and Mrs. Barrows catapulted through it.
Is the little rat denying it? He can't get away with that.
Mr. Martin got up and moved discreetly to a point beside Mr. Fitweiler's chair.
You drank and smoked at my apartment and you know it. You called Mr. Fitweiler an old windbag and said you were going to blow him up when you got coked to the gills on your heroin.
She stopped yelling to catch her breath, and a new glint came into her popping eyes.
If you weren't such a drab, ordinary little man, I'd think you'd planned it all. Sticking your tongue out, saying you were sitting in the Catbird Seat because you thought no one would believe me when I told it? My God, it's really too perfect.
She glared at Mr. Fitweiler.
Can't you see how he's tricked us, you old fool? Can't you see his little game?
But Mr. Fitweiler had been surreptitiously pressing all the buttons under the top of his desk, and employees of F&S began pouring into the room.
Stockton, you and Fishbein will take Mrs. Barrows to her home. Mrs. Powell, you will go with them.
Stockton, who had played a little football in high school, blocked Mrs. Barrows as she made for Mr. Martin. It took him and Fishbein together to force her out of the door into the hall, crowded with stenographers and office boys. She was still screaming imprecations at Mr. Martin, tangled and contradictory imprecations. The hubbub finally died out down in the corridor.
I regret that this has happened. I shall ask you to dismiss it from your mind, Martin.
Yes, sir.
Anticipating his chief's "that will be all" by moving to the door.
I will dismiss it.
He went out and shut the door, and his step was light and quick in the hall. When he entered his department, he had slowed down to his customary gait, and he walked quietly across the room to the W-20 file, wearing a look of studious concentration. You have just heard James Thurber's The Catbird Seat on the CJSW Playhouse, produced and directed by Justin Guild. Mr. Martin was played by Robert Carrick, Uljean Barrows by Angie Stimson, Mr. Fitweiler by Mike Anthony, Ms. Perd by Sarah Rowe, Mr. Schlosser by Adam Camus, Joey Hart by Justin Guild. Tonight's play was narrated by your loyal announcer, Stuart Bentley. Hey, that's me! CJSW Playhouse is a co-production of CJSW 90.9 FM and performed by the talented actors of the Calgary Radio Playhouse. Until next time, this is Stuart Bentley, wishing you peace and a pleasant tomorrow.